Judge Vanessa Carter had spent the majority of her life navigating through the intricate layers of the justice system, earning her a well-deserved reputation as a no-nonsense federal judge with a sharp intellect and an unshakable moral compass. Despite her high status and the responsibilities that came with her title, she had always remained grounded, rooted in the values her parents instilled in her during her childhood. Her parents, both teachers in a struggling inner-city school, had taught her the importance of giving back to the community, of using her position not to elevate herself but to lift others. It was a lesson that Vanessa carried with her into adulthood, one that shaped her career and her actions beyond the courtroom. On a damp, cold evening, Vanessa found herself in an area she hadn't visited in years, a forgotten corner of her old neighborhood, now reduced to a series of crumbling industrial buildings, broken streetlights, and graffiti-covered walls. Despite its decay, this part of town held memories for her, both good and bad. It was here, among the worn brick facades and echoing streets, that she had grown up, forged friendships, and learned resilience. Tonight, she had returned, not as the powerful federal judge known across the state, but as Vanessa Carter, a volunteer lending her time to a grassroots organization committed to helping the homeless. Her presence was quiet and unobtrusive, dressed in practical jeans, a dark hooded sweatshirt, and a sturdy pair of boots. There was no sign of her prestigious career in her attire, no expensive jewelry, no polished courtroom demeanor, just a woman determined to contribute to a cause close to her heart. The organization she was assisting had set up a small camp near an abandoned factory, using its overhangs for shelter against the persistent drizzle that soaked the city streets. Tables had been arranged with hot meals, warm clothes, and hygiene supplies for those in need. Vanessa worked alongside other volunteers, some of whom were longtime residents of the area who remembered her from her youth, though few realized the heights she had reached since then. She preferred it that way. Tonight wasn't about recognition, it was about offering comfort and dignity to those society had left behind. As she handed out bowls of steaming soup and packages of socks, she found herself exchanging words of encouragement with strangers who, despite their hardships, managed to smile and express their gratitude. Each interaction grounded her further, reminding her why she fought so fiercely for justice in her courtroom. But while the camp bustled with quiet activity, the surrounding neighborhood remained a stark reminder of the systemic neglect that had plagued it for decades. The distant hum of sirens punctuated the night air, a reminder that law enforcement was never far away in areas like these, though not always in a way that inspired trust or safety. Over the years, Vanessa had presided over countless cases that underscored the fractured relationship between the police and marginalized communities, and tonight, the tension in the air felt tangible. The rain made the ground slick, reflecting the dim, flickering streetlights like broken mirrors. Shadows stretched long and ominous across the cracked pavement, and an uneasy silence hung over the blocks just outside the reach of the camp's warm glow. Among those patrolling the area that evening was Officer Derek Stone, a man whose approach to policing was shaped by cynicism, frustration, and a deep-seated bias he barely recognized in himself. Stone had been on the force for over a decade, his career marked by commendations for bravery but also whispered complaints about his abrasive demeanor and quick temper. Tonight he was particularly on edge. Earlier in the evening, a raid meant to apprehend a group of drug dealers in a nearby warehouse had gone sideways, leaving Stone humiliated in front of his team. Though the suspects had escaped, he had taken it upon himself to patrol the surrounding blocks, convinced they were still lurking nearby. His frustration boiled over as he prowled the streets in his squad car. eyes scanning for anything or anyone that might give him a reason to assert his authority. It wasn't long before he spotted the camp under the factory overhang, the figures of volunteers and homeless individuals illuminated by the soft glow of makeshift lanterns. From his vantage point, Stone's perspective warped the scene. To him, the gathering looked less like a charity effort and more like a hot spot for illegal activity, a cover for drug deals or worse. His jaw tightened as he parked his car at the curb and stepped out, rain slicking the brim of his cap as he adjusted it against the drizzle. He approached the camp with heavy, deliberate steps, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles that dotted the uneven pavement. As he drew closer, his hand rested on the hilt of his flashlight, the gesture more instinctual than intentional, a subtle signal of his readiness to act if needed. Vanessa noticed him almost immediately. It wasn't difficult to spot the imposing figure of a uniformed officer in a space like this, where vulnerability and trust often hung by a thread. She exchanged a wary glance with another volunteer before stepping forward, her expression calm but cautious. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the knot of unease forming in her stomach. She knew well how quickly interactions like this could spiral, especially in a neighborhood where trust in law enforcement was fragile at best. "Can I help you with something?" Stone's gaze swept over her, lingering just long enough to register the confidence in her stance, the intelligence in her eyes. Something about her unsettled him, though he couldn't place it. To him, she looked out of place not because of her race, but because of the quiet authority she exuded, even dressed in plain clothes. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone curt. His eyes darted to the tables of supplies, the scattered group of individuals huddled under the overhang. "This area is not exactly zoned for whatever this is." "It's a volunteer effort," Vanessa replied, choosing her words carefully. "We're providing food and essentials to those in need. Everything is above board. We've coordinated with local organizations." Stone wasn't convinced. His mind was already racing, fueled by assumptions and the lingering frustration from his earlier failure. "I'll need to see some documentation," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "This doesn't look very official to me." Vanessa resisted the urge to sigh, instead gesturing toward a small clipboard on one of the tables. "Our permits and permissions are there. You're welcome to look." As Stone moved to inspect the documents, his radio crackled with static, followed by the voice of his sergeant ordering him to return to the station for debriefing. He ignored it, his focus narrowing on the camp. The frustration in his chest twisted into something sharper, an almost instinctual need to assert control over a situation he didn't fully understand but already distrusted. Turning back to Vanessa, he saw her watching him closely, her calm demeanor only aggravating him further. "You," he said, stepping closer, his voice rising slightly. "What's your role in all this? You some kind of organizer?" Vanessa met his gaze without flinching. "I'm just here to help," she said simply. But her answer didn't satisfy him. To Stone, her composure felt like defiance, her calmness like a challenge. And as the rain continued to fall, the tension between them thickened, setting the stage for a confrontation that would alter both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The air around the camp was thick with an uneasy tension as Officer Derek Stone stood amidst the volunteers and homeless individuals, his presence casting a long shadow over the quiet work being done. His demeanor was confrontational, his posture rigid as he flipped through the clipboard Vanessa had handed him. The rain continued its steady drizzle, soaking into his uniform and streaking the pages of the documents, but he seemed unbothered, his focus entirely on finding anything that might give him an excuse to escalate the situation. Vanessa stood a few feet away, watching him carefully. She had dealt with men like Stone before, men who wore their authority like armor, using it to shield themselves from the world's complexities while wielding it as a weapon against those they deemed inferior. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the clipboard a little too tightly. It was clear he was looking for a reason to act, to assert control over a situation he didn't fully understand but already distrusted. She felt the knot of unease in her stomach tighten, but kept her expression neutral, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her ruffled. "This all looks questionable," Stone muttered, his eyes scanning the permits. He wasn't reading them so much as searching for a loophole, a technicality he could exploit. "Who authorized this?" "You got signatures, but that doesn't mean much out here. Could forge these for all I know." Vanessa took a slow breath, resisting the urge to respond with the sharpness she felt bubbling under the surface. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice steady. "The documents are legitimate. If you'd like to verify them, you can contact the city office. They're aware of this initiative. We're here to help, Officer Stone. That's all." Her measured tone only seemed to irritate him further. He turned to face her fully, his gaze narrowing as he studied her face. Something about her composure, her unwavering calm in the face of his authority, grated on his nerves. He was used to people flinching, stammering, backing down under his scrutiny. But this woman, there was something about her that felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. And that difference only made him more determined to knock her off balance. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice sharper now. "Vanessa," she replied simply, offering no further details. "Vanessa what?" He pressed, taking a step closer. The rain slicked his boots, the sound of his movements loud against the wet pavement. She didn't flinch. "Just Vanessa." The vague response was deliberate, a calculated decision on her part. She knew revealing her full name and status at this moment would shift the dynamic entirely, and not in a way that would de-escalate the situation. Men like Stone didn't respond well to being reminded that they were overstepping their bounds, especially by someone they perceived as a challenge to their authority. Instead, she held his gaze, her calmness acting as a shield against his growing frustration. Stone's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't like her tone, her refusal to bend to his authority. To him, it reeked of defiance, and defiance was something he wouldn't tolerate. "Listen, Vanessa," he said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous tone. "You may think you're doing some good here, but this isn't your playground. This is a crime-ridden area, and gatherings like this attract all kinds of trouble. I need you to shut this down and clear out before things get worse." Vanessa folded her arms, her expression unchanging. "With all due respect, officer, we're not doing anything illegal. We're here to provide food and clothing to people who need it. If you have concerns, you're welcome to raise them with the organizers, but we're not going anywhere." The quiet conviction in her voice only stoked the fire in him. Stone felt his frustration boiling over, his earlier humiliation during the botched raid fueling his need to regain control, to assert his dominance over the situation. He took another step toward her, his voice rising. "I said clear out. That wasn't a suggestion." A murmur rippled through the group of volunteers and homeless individuals as they watched the exchange, their unease growing. One of the volunteers, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "Officer, we're just trying to help," he said, his tone placating. "There's no need to." Stone's glare snapped to the man, silencing him immediately. "I'm not talking to you," he barked. "Step back." The man hesitated, glancing at Vanessa for reassurance. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, silently urging him to step away. Reluctantly he did, retreating into the crowd as Stone turned his attention back to her. "You're obstructing police orders," he said, his voice hard. "That's grounds for removal. If you don't want to cooperate, I'll have to take you in." Vanessa's jaw tightened, though her expression remained calm. She knew this was the moment he'd been pushing toward from the beginning, a manufactured confrontation to justify his heavy-handed approach. But she also knew she couldn't afford to escalate the situation further, not with so many vulnerable people around. She had to tread carefully. "Officer Stone," she said evenly, her voice carrying a note of quiet authority that gave him pause. "We're not obstructing anything. We're here legally with proper permits. You're overstepping." Her words hit him like a slap, not because they were loud or accusatory, but because of the sheer confidence behind them. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by anger. He couldn't back down now, not in front of the crowd, not after she had challenged him so openly. He needed to reassert control, to remind everyone who was in charge. Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched toward the nearby fire truck parked on the curb. The truck had been left behind earlier in the evening after the fire department had extinguished a small blaze in a nearby alley. Stone didn't hesitate as he grabbed the hose coiled at the truck's side, dragging it toward the camp with single-minded determination. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly as she realized what he was about to do. "What are you doing?" she called out, her voice firm but tinged with disbelief. Stone didn't answer. Instead, he uncoiled the hose with practiced efficiency, his fingers tightening around the nozzle as he turned the valve. A powerful stream of water burst forth, cutting through the rain as it asked toward the group. Shouts erupted as volunteers and homeless individuals scrambled to get out of the way, the force of the water knocking over tables and scattering supplies. Vanessa stood her ground, her body tense as the icy spray hit her square in the chest, soaking her to the bone and nearly knocking her off her feet. She staggered slightly but quickly regained her balance, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The cold bit into her skin, but she refused to move, her defiance a silent challenge to Stone's authority. "Enough," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is an abuse of power, and you know it." Stone's face twisted with anger as he kept the hose trained on her, the water pounding against her unyielding figure. To him, her refusal to back down was a direct affront, a threat to his control. He didn't care about the consequences anymore, he just wanted to win, to see her submit. But Vanessa didn't waver. As the water continued to soak her, she locked eyes with him, her gaze steady and unflinching. Her calmness only seemed to fuel his rage, but beneath his anger there was a flicker of something else: uncertainty, doubt. And for the first time, he realized he might have underestimated her. The rain continued to fall, mingling with the spray of the hose as the tension in the air thickened. Vanessa's voice rang out once more, clear and unwavering. "You've crossed a line, officer, and you will be held accountable for it." The silence that followed Vanessa Carter's unwavering declaration was deafening, broken only by the relentless hiss of the fire hose and the patter of rain against the uneven asphalt. Officer Derek Stone stood frozen for a moment, his grip on the hose tightening as her words settled in the air between them. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white, as he wrestled with the reality that this soaked, bedraggled woman who had refused to flinch under the force of the water had just spoken to him as though he were the one out of line. The defiance in her tone, the absolute conviction in her gaze, set his teeth on edge. She was standing there, drenched and shivering, yet she hadn't cowered, hadn't begged him to stop. In fact, she seemed to grow stronger with every second that passed, her resolve cutting through the chaos like a blade. Stone's mind raced. The cold logic of his training told him to back off, to assess the situation and recalibrate his approach. but his pride screamed otherwise. He couldn't let her win, not here, not in front of the growing crowd that had gathered just beyond the camp. The homeless individuals and volunteers, who had initially scattered under the blast of water, were beginning to regroup at the edges of the scene, their eyes locked on the unfolding confrontation. Some stood in stunned silence, while others whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. The tension in the air was palpable, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Vanessa, meanwhile, took a step forward, her feet squelching in the water pooling beneath her. Her hands were steady, her posture unwavering despite the chill that had seeped into her bones. Her voice, though calm, carried an edge of iron. "Officer Stone," she began, enunciating each word with deliberate clarity, "this is not how you uphold the law. This is how you destroy trust, trust in your badge, trust in your department, trust in the very system you claim to serve." Stone's nostrils flared as her words hit their mark. He wanted to snap back, to tell her to shut up, to assert his authority and silence her once and for all. But something about the way she spoke, something about the weight of her words gave him pause. It was as if she weren't just speaking to him, but to the invisible audience of accountability that loomed over every officer's actions. Her tone carried a gravitas he couldn't quite place, a power that felt wholly out of sync with her unassuming appearance. "You think you can lecture me?" Stone spat, his voice rising in volume. He let go of the hose, letting it fall to the ground with a heavy thud, the stream of water sputtering to a stop. He advanced on her, his boots splashing through the puddles, until he was mere inches away. His towering frame loomed over her, but Vanessa didn't step back. If anything, she seemed to grow taller, meeting his gaze with an unflinching intensity that made his pulse quicken. "I'm not lecturing you," she replied evenly. "I'm warning you. You've already crossed the line. Every step you take from here will only make it worse for you, for your career, for the very people you're supposed to protect." Stone scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could hear the whispers growing louder. The situation was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. He needed to regain control, to remind everyone who held the power in this moment. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed Vanessa's arm, his grip firm but not quite bruising. The act was instinctual, an assertion of dominance meant to put her in her place. The collective gasp that rippled through the crowd was immediate, sharp as a knife. Vanessa didn't resist, she didn't even flinch, but the tension in her body was palpable, a coiled strength held in check by sheer force of will. Her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment Stone felt a flicker of doubt, a tiny crack in the armor of his self-righteousness. "Let go," she said, her voice low but resolute. Stone hesitated. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to release her, to de-escalate before the situation spiraled completely out of control. But his pride, his anger, his need to assert his authority over this woman, who dared to defy him, it all boiled to the surface, drowning out reason. His grip tightened, and he pulled her closer, his voice dropping into a growl. "Or what?" he challenged, his breath hot against the cool night air. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer immediately, letting the weight of the moment hang between them like a drawn bowstring. When she finally spoke, her words were deliberate, measured, and laced with quiet menace. "You don't want to find out." Stone's jaw worked as he struggled to process the sheer audacity of her response. For a moment he thought she might be bluffing, but the unshakable confidence in her tone sent a chill down his spine. There was something she wasn't telling him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt a sliver of fear. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, emboldened by Vanessa's defiance. A young woman in a tattered raincoat stepped forward, her voice quavering but determined. "She's right," the woman said, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her coat. "You're out of line, officer. We're just trying to help people, and you're treating us like criminals." Stone's head snapped toward the woman, his glare silencing her mid-sentence. "Stay out of this," he barked, his voice cracking like a whip. The woman flinched but didn't retreat, her wide eyes darting between him and Vanessa as though weighing her next move. Vanessa took advantage of the distraction, twisting her arm just enough to break free of Stone's grip. She stepped back, putting a small but deliberate distance between them, her expression unreadable. "You've already made a mistake," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "Don't make it worse." Stone's hands curled into fists at his sides, his frustration mounting with every passing second. He could feel the situation spiraling beyond his control, the eyes of the crowd turning from fearful to defiant. He needed to act, to regain the upper hand, but every instinct he relied on seemed to falter in the face of Vanessa's unshakable composure. "You think you're untouchable," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "You think you can just stand there and talk your way out of this?" "I don't need to talk my way out of anything," Vanessa replied, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Your actions speak for themselves, and they will have consequences." The words hung in the air like a guillotine, their weight pressing down on Stone with a force he couldn't ignore. He opened his mouth to retort, to lash out, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. He turned to see his partner, Officer Jared Willis, jogging toward them, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Stone, what the hell's going on here?" Willis demanded, his eyes flicking between the drenched crowd, the fallen fire hose and Vanessa's soaked figure. "I heard shouting all the way from the next block." "Just handling the situation," Stone snapped, his tone defensive. "These people were loitering, causing a disturbance." Willis frowned, his gaze lingering on Vanessa. There was something about her posture, her expression, that gave him pause. "They don't look like they're causing trouble," he said carefully. "And that woman doesn't look like someone you should be roughing up." Stone's face darkened, his frustration bubbling over. "You don't know what you're talking about, Jared. Just stay out of it." But Willis didn't back down. Instead, he stepped closer to Vanessa, his tone softening. "Mom, is everything all right?" Vanessa met his gaze, her eyes steady. "It will be," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But only if your partner stops making it worse." Willis's brow furrowed as he looked back at Stone, his unease growing. "Stone, maybe we should." "I said I've got it handled." Stone barked, his voice cracking with frustration. The outburst only served to deepen the tension, the crowd shifting uneasily as the standoff dragged on. Vanessa, however, remained unmoved. Her gaze stayed locked on Stone, her expression unyielding. And in that moment he realized he had already lost. The storm of tension swirling in the camp seemed to grow heavier as Officer Stone stood amidst the wreckage of his own actions. The fire hose lay abandoned at his feet, its long coils trailing water across the asphalt, while Vanessa Carter remained unmoved, drenched but unbroken, a silent monument to his overreach. The murmurs from the crowd had grown louder now, emboldened by the presence of Stone's partner, Officer Jared Willis, who had stepped in, his concerned gaze darting between Stone and the woman at the center of it all. Stone's mind raced, his frustration and embarrassment boiling just beneath the surface. His grip on the situation was slipping, and he could feel the weight of every eye on him, judging, questioning. It wasn't just the crowd, it was his own partner's quiet scrutiny that gnawed at him the most. Jared's hesitation, the uncertainty in his voice when he'd said, "Stone, maybe we should back off," had been like a knife to his pride. Stone had prided himself on being decisive, on commanding respect or, when necessary, fear. But now, fear was beginning to creep up his own spine, though he refused to acknowledge it. Vanessa shifted slightly, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the scene. Her voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the noise. "Officer Willis," she began, addressing the younger man without so much as glancing at Stone. "I suggest you take control of this situation before it escalates further. Your partner has already crossed several lines, and I'd hate for you to be implicated in what happens next." Willis hesitated, his eyes flicking to Stone, whose face flushed with anger. "I've got it under control," Stone snapped, his voice sharp enough to make a few people in the crowd flinch. But Willis didn't back away. His expression remained uncertain, conflicted, as though he were weighing his options. Vanessa seized the moment, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Stone's simmering rage. "Officer," she continued, "your actions have endangered civilians, violated protocol, and undermined the very principles you're supposed to uphold. If you step back now and de-escalate, it might still be possible to salvage this situation." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Stone's fists clenched at his sides, his pride warring with the logic of her argument. He wanted to lash out, to shut her down, but a part of him buried deep beneath the layers of arrogance and defensiveness recognized the truth in her statement. Still, he couldn't bring himself to back down, not in front of the crowd, not in front of his partner, and certainly not in front of her. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job," he growled, taking a step closer to Vanessa. The proximity was meant to intimidate, to reassert his dominance, but she didn't so much as flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unyielding. "No," she replied evenly. "What you need is to remember why you wear that badge in the first place. It's not to harass or humiliate people, it's to protect and serve." The quiet conviction in her tone struck a nerve, though Stone refused to show it. Instead, he turned his frustration on Willis, who was now standing a few steps behind him, his expression unreadable. "Jared, are you just going to stand there?" Stone barked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his anger. "Do your damn job." Willis hesitated, his eyes flicking between Stone and Vanessa. For a moment it seemed as though he might comply, might step forward and back his partner despite his reservations. But then his gaze settled on Vanessa, on the calm strength in her posture, and something in him shifted. He'd seen plenty of people break under pressure, plenty of suspects crumble in the face of authority. But this woman wasn't a suspect, and she certainly wasn't crumbling. There was something about her presence, her confidence, that made him pause. "Maybe we should call this in," Willis said at last, his voice quiet but firm. The suggestion landed like a blow, and Stone's head snapped toward him, disbelief and fury etched across his face. "Call this in?" Stone repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. "Are you out of your mind? You want to let her win." "It's not about winning, Derek," Willis replied, his voice steady despite the tension between them. "It's about doing the right thing." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that Stone wasn't prepared to face. His anger flared, blinding him to the warning signs that had been building all around him, the murmurs of the crowd, the pointed stares, the way Willis had subtly shifted his stance, positioning himself between Stone and Vanessa. In that moment, Stone felt his grip on the situation slipping entirely, and his frustration reached its breaking point. "Fine," he snapped, his voice rising with each word. "You want to call it in? Go ahead. But don't come crying to me when this all goes sideways." Willis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out his radio, his movements deliberate as he prepared to make the call. But before he could speak, Vanessa's voice cut through the air once more. "That won't be necessary," she said, her tone calm but commanding. Her words brought both men's attention back to her, their gazes locking onto her as she stepped forward. "This has gone far enough. Officer Stone, you've made your choices. Now it's time to face the consequences." Stone's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get to decide that," he spat, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. Vanessa didn't waver. She reached into her pocket, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out a small leather case. Stone's eyes narrowed as she opened it, revealing the unmistakable emblem of a federal judge. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he could do nothing but stare. The crowd, too, fell silent, their murmurs replaced by a stunned hush as they registered what was happening. Vanessa's calm demeanor, her unshakable confidence, it all made sense now. She wasn't just a volunteer or an organizer. She was someone with the authority to hold Stone accountable in ways he hadn't even begun to consider. "You're a judge," Willis said, his voice barely above a whisper. The shock in his tone was mirrored in his wide eyes as he took a step back, as though he were trying to process the implications of what he'd just witnessed. Vanessa nodded, her gaze never leaving Stone. "Federal Judge Vanessa Carter," she said, her tone cool and measured. "And I've seen enough." Stone's mind reeled as the weight of her words settled over him. The humiliation, the rage, the fear, it all came crashing down at once, leaving him struggling to regain his footing. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but no words came out. For the first time since the confrontation began, he was at a loss. Vanessa took another step forward, her voice dropping into a tone that was both firm and final. "You've abused your authority, endangered innocent civilians, and brought disgrace to your badge. And trust me when I say this, you will be held accountable." The words were a death knell, reverberating through the air like the final blow in a long, drawn-out battle. Stone felt the weight of every action he'd taken, every choice he'd made, pressing down on him like a physical force. The crowd, now emboldened by Vanessa's revelation, began to murmur once more, their voices filled with a mix of anger and vindication. Willis, for his part, seemed frozen in place, his gaze locked on Vanessa, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Slowly he lowered his radio, his hand trembling slightly as he took a step back. "Derek," he said at last, his voice barely audible. "What have you done?" But Stone didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was stand there drenched and defeated, as the full weight of his actions and their consequences came crashing down around him. The air hung heavy with tension as Vanessa Carter's declaration reverberated through the camp. Her words carried a finality that shook Officer Derek Stone to his core, though he fought to keep it from showing. The revelation of her identity had rendered him momentarily speechless, but his mind churned with a volatile mix of rage, disbelief, and panic. He glanced at his partner, Jared Willis, who stood rooted in place, his expression one of quiet shock. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their collective energy now emboldened by the realization that this woman, this soaked, defiant woman, was no ordinary bystander. She was someone with the authority to hold him accountable. Someone with the power to dismantle the false reality of control he had so desperately clung to. For a brief moment, Stone felt a flicker of something foreign, regret, perhaps, or fear, but it was quickly drowned out by the louder voice of his ego, the one that refused to accept what was happening. He had built his career on an unshakable belief in his authority, in his ability to dictate the narrative of any encounter. But now the belief was crumbling piece by piece, and he was scrambling to regain his footing. "That's enough," Stone growled, his voice lower now, tinged with desperation. "I don't care who you are, you're interfering with law enforcement. You think flashing that badge means you can just walk away from this? Not a chance." Vanessa didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her posture calm but unyielding. "Officer Stone," she said, her voice carrying an air of quiet command, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your next move. You're already on the wrong side of the law. Pushing this further will only make it worse." The crowd stirred at her words, their murmurs swelling into a low hum of discontent. People shifted forward slightly, their faces a mix of indignation and curiosity, as though they were waiting for something definitive to happen. Stone could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down like an unbearable burden. His hands balled into fists at his sides, his mind racing for a way out of this spiraling mess. Willis, who had been standing silently until now, finally spoke, his tone hesitant but firm. "Derek, maybe we should take a step back. She's a federal judge, for God's sake. This isn't something we can just brush off." Stone whipped around to face him, his expression twisted with frustration. "Step back," he repeated, his voice rising. "You want to step back and let her win. Let them all win." He gestured wildly toward the crowd, his anger spilling over. "This is our jurisdiction, Jared. Our authority. And I'm not about to let some volunteer make a mockery of it." "She's not just a volunteer," Willis shot back, his voice gaining strength despite the tremor in his hands. "And this isn't about winning or losing. This is about doing the right thing." Stone's face darkened, his frustration boiling over into fury. "The right thing?" he snapped. "You think letting her walk away after this circus is the right thing? You think he jabbed a finger toward Vanessa, his voice dripping with contempt, "gets to stand there and lecture me about the law while she undermines my authority? No, Jared. That's not how this works." But even as he spoke, Stone could feel the cracks in his resolve deepening. His words rang hollow even to his own ears, and the weight of the moment pressed down harder. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were bearing witness. Every move he made now felt magnified, scrutinized, and he couldn't escape the sense that the ground was shifting beneath him. Vanessa, meanwhile, remained silent, allowing his outburst to play itself out. Her stillness was a deliberate choice, a calculated response that only heightened the contrast between her composed demeanor and his unraveling. She knew the power of silence, of letting someone else's words hang in the air, exposed for what they were. And in this moment, Stone's words carried nothing but desperation. Finally she spoke, her tone measured but cutting. "Your authority doesn't come from your badge, officer. It comes from your ability to uphold the law with integrity. Right now, you're not just failing to do that, you're actively betraying it." The crowd stirred again, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. Stone could feel the shift in their energy, the way it seemed to coalesce around her, bolstering her position while isolating him further. His chest tightened, his breathing shallow as the reality of the situation began to close in. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You don't know what it's like out here, dealing with this mess day in and day out." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "What I know," she said, her voice steady, "is that every decision you make, every action you take, carries consequences. You've made your choices, officer. Now you have to face the fallout." Stone opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, his radio crackled to life, the sharp burst of static cutting through the tension like a knife. The voice of the dispatcher came through, urgent and clipped. "Unit 14, this is Central. What's your status?" "Over." Willis reached for his own radio, his movements automatic, but Stone stopped him with a glare. "Don't," he snapped, his voice low but dangerous. "This is my scene. I'll handle it." Willis hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio, but Vanessa's voice broke through before he could decide. "Handle it how, exactly?" she asked, her tone laced with quiet challenge. "By ignoring protocol? By escalating a situation that didn't need to escalate in the first place?" Stone's head whipped around to face her, his eyes blazing with anger. "You don't get to dictate how I do my job," he snarled. "You don't know the first thing about what it takes to keep this city in line." Vanessa's expression didn't change, though her eyes seemed to harden slightly. "What it takes," she said, her voice like steel, "is integrity, discipline, respect for the law, qualities you seem to have forgotten somewhere along the way." The words landed like a blow, and for a moment Stone could do nothing but glare at her, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself together. The crowd was murmuring louder now, their discontent bubbling to the surface. He could feel the energy shifting against him, the tide turning in a way he couldn't control. And then, as if to punctuate the moment, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Stone's stomach dropped as he realized what it meant. Someone, perhaps a member of the crowd, or maybe even Willis, had called for backup. The situation was no longer his to control. The cavalry was coming, and with them, the accountability he had been so desperate to avoid. The sirens grew louder, closer, until finally a pair of squad cars pulled up at the edge of the camp. The flashing blue and red lights painted the scene in harsh, flickering hues, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Stone turned to face the approaching officers, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation, to spin it in his favor. But as the first officer stepped out of his car, Stone's hope evaporated. The officer, a sergeant with a stern expression and a no-nonsense demeanor, took one look at the scene and immediately strode toward Vanessa. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice respectful but urgent. "Are you all right?" Vanessa nodded, her gaze never leaving Stone. "I'm fine, Sergeant," she replied. "But I can't say the same for Officer Stone." The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he turned to Stone, his expression hardening. "What the hell's going on here, Stone?" Stone's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, he was utterly and completely at a loss. The consequences he had been so determined to avoid had finally arrived, and there was nowhere left to run. The weight of the moment pressed down on Derek Stone like an iron vice. The flashing lights of the squad cars threw chaotic patterns of red and blue across the wet pavement, illuminating the soaked crowd, the abandoned fire hose, and the resolute figure of Vanessa Carter standing in stark defiance of him. The sergeant who had arrived grizzled, no nonsense, and exuding authority waited for an answer, his sharp gaze locked on Stone. Every second of silence deepened the pit in Stone's stomach, but he couldn't find the words to justify his actions. The carefully constructed narrative of control and authority he had built was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of the truth. "Sergeant Reed," Vanessa said, breaking the tension with her calm, measured voice. She turned her attention to the arriving officer, her composure unshaken despite the events of the evening. "I believe you'll find this situation enlightening." Reed's eyes flicked to her, his expression softening slightly with recognition. "Judge Carter," he acknowledged with a curt nod, his voice carrying a tone of respect. "I wasn't aware you were involved in this." His gaze shifted back to Stone, hardening once more. "What exactly is going on here, Officer Stone?" Stone swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the rain still misting down from the darkened sky. He opened his mouth to respond, but his voice faltered. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, Vanessa's unflinching stare, Willis's uneasy gaze, the crowd's mix of anger and anticipation. It was suffocating. She's interfering with police work, Stone blurted finally, his voice uneven and defensive. This gathering wasn't authorized. I was trying to disperse them for public safety. Reed's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Public safety? He repeated, his tone skeptical. He glanced around, taking in the scene, the scattered supplies, the volunteers clutching blankets and food, the fearful faces of the homeless individuals huddled at the edges of the crowd. Doesn't look like a riot to me, Stone. Looks more like a charity effort. Stone's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. They didn't have the right permits. And he jabbed a finger toward Vanessa, was resisting orders. Vanessa's voice cut through his accusations, steady and sharp. Resisting unlawful orders, Officer Stone, she said. There's a difference. And I'm sure Sergeant Reed is fully aware of what constitutes lawful conduct. Reed's gaze flicked back to her, his expression grim. He'd heard enough stories about Stone over the years to recognize the signs of an officer who'd let power go to his head. He didn't need the full details to see that this situation had gone beyond protocol, beyond reason. Stone, he said, his tone firm, stepped back. Now. Stone's face reddened, his pride wounded by the public reprimand. Sergeant, That's not a request, Reed interrupted, his voice sharp. Stand down. For a moment, Stone hesitated, his mind racing for a way to regain control. But the weight of Reed's authority, coupled with the presence of Vanessa and the growing murmurs from the crowd, left him with no options. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped back, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Reed turned to Vanessa, his expression apologetic. Judge Carter, I'm sorry for any misconduct you've experienced tonight. Rest assured, this will be addressed immediately. Vanessa gave a small nod, though her gaze remained fixed on Stone. Thank you, Sergeant. But this isn't just about me. Officer Stone's actions tonight have endangered everyone here. His conduct is a threat to public trust in law enforcement. Reed's expression darkened, the weight of her words sinking in. He turned to Willis, who had been standing silently at the edge of the scene, his discomfort palpable. Officer Willis, Reed said, his voice firm but not unkind, did you witness what happened here? Willis hesitated, his gaze darting between Stone and Vanessa. His loyalty to his partner warred with his sense of justice, the internal conflict written plainly across his face. Finally, he let out a heavy breath and nodded. Yes, Sergeant, I did. Reed's eyes narrowed. And? Willis swallowed hard, his voice low but steady. Stone, he overstepped. He used a fire hose on unarmed civilians. He ignored attempts to de-escalate. And when Judge Carter identified herself, he refused to listen. The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Stone's head snapped toward Willis, his expression a mix of betrayal and fury. Jared, what the hell are you doing? He spat. I'm telling the truth, Willis said quietly, his gaze dropping to the ground. Because it's the right thing to do. Reed nodded, his expression grim. Thank you, Officer Willis. He turned back to Stone, his voice hardening. Stone, I need your badge and your weapon. Effective immediately, you're relieved of duty pending an internal investigation. Stone's eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious, he said, his voice shaking. I was doing my job. I was trying to maintain order. You are abusing your power, Reed shot back. And I'm not going to let this department take the fall for your mistakes. The sergeant's words hit Stone like a sledgehammer, the final blow to his crumbling facade. He stared at Reed, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. But there was no room for argument. Slowly, reluctantly, he unholstered his weapon and handed it over, followed by his badge. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the once dominant officer was stripped of his authority, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his disgrace. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Sergeant Reed," she said, "I trust that this matter will be handled thoroughly." "It will be, Judge Carter," Reed assured her. "You have my word." She nodded, her gaze lingering on Stone for a moment before she turned to address the crowd. "Thank you all for standing your ground tonight," she said, her voice carrying over the rain-soaked streets. "Your courage in the face of injustice is a reminder of the strength we all carry within us." The crowd began to stir, their murmurs of uncertainty giving way to quiet affirmations. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged looks of relief and gratitude. The tension that had gripped the scene slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. As the squad cars prepared to depart, Vanessa turned back to Reed. "Sergeant, one more thing," she said. "I'll be following up on this personally. Expect a call from my office." Reed nodded, his expression resolute. "Understood, Judge." With that, Vanessa stepped away from the scene, her steps steady despite the weight of the evening's events. The crowd parted to let her pass, their eyes following her with a mix of awe and respect. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the camp, where a group of volunteers waited to regroup and continue their work. Behind her, Stone stood in stunned silence, his career and reputation lying in tatters. The consequences of his actions had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping the judgment that awaited him not just from the department, but from the law itself. And as the rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of the chaos he had caused, the lesson became painfully clear. Power without accountability was a hollow thing, and justice always found its way to the light. The days following the confrontation at the camp unfolded like ripples in a pond, spreading far beyond the boundaries of that rain-soaked street. Officer Derek Stone's world unraveled at an unstoppable pace, the consequences of his actions cascading down with a weight he was unprepared to bear. The department moved swiftly, Stone was suspended without pay, and an internal investigation was launched. His name was plastered on disciplinary reports, his record tarnished by the official complaints filed against him, not only by Judge Vanessa Carter but also by the volunteers and community members who had been present that night. For Stone, it was more than a career setback, it was a dismantling of the identity he had built around his badge, authority, and the misguided belief that he was untouchable. Meanwhile, Vanessa's name surged into conversations far beyond the camp. News of her actions, standing firm in the face of abuse, defending the vulnerable, and exposing corruption within the system traveled quickly, not through viral videos or flashy headlines, but through quiet, reverent retellings among community groups, legal circles, and even the judiciary itself. Her composure, her refusal to bow to intimidation, became a source of inspiration for those who often felt powerless against institutional failures. Yet, Vanessa herself remained grounded, continuing her work without drawing attention to what had happened. For her, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about fulfilling the responsibilities that came with her position ensuring justice, even when the odds were stacked against her. Days turned into weeks, and Stone's disciplinary hearing approached. It was an event that garnered significant attention within the police department and beyond. For years, whispers had circulated about Stone's behavior, his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily, his disregard for proper protocol, his growing disdain for the communities he was supposed to serve. Many of his colleagues had turned a blind eye, chalking it up to the stress of the job. But now those whispers had turned into pointed questions. The hearing wasn't just about Stone. It was about the culture that had allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. Vanessa was summoned to testify, her presence casting a long shadow over the proceedings. When she entered the room, dressed in her judicial robes, there was an almost palpable shift in the atmosphere. Stone, seated at the far end of the chamber, avoided her gaze, his face pale and drawn. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the bravado that had defined him during their confrontation. Vanessa, in contrast, exuded quiet strength, her presence a reminder of the stakes at hand. When her turn to speak came, she rose with calm authority, her words measured and precise. She recounted the events of that night with unflinching clarity, sparing no detail. She spoke of Stone's abuse of power, his reckless disregard for the safety of civilians, and his refusal to listen even when faced with clear evidence of his wrongdoing. Her testimony was damning, not because of its harshness but because of its undeniable truth. Every word she spoke was a reflection of the principles she upheld: a commitment to justice, accountability, and the protection of the vulnerable. Stone's defense was weak at best. His attorney attempted to frame his actions as the result of stress and miscommunication, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness testimonies from Willis, the volunteers, and even members of the crowd painted a picture of a man who had let his biases and frustration override his duty. The disciplinary board listened intently, their expressions grim as the reality of Stone's behavior became impossible to ignore. In the end, the decision was unanimous. Stone was formally dismissed from the force, his badge and weapon permanently revoked. The board cited not only his actions at the camp, but also a pattern of behavior that had undermined the integrity of the department. For Stone, it was the end of a career he had once prided himself on, a fall from grace that left him with little more than the bitter realization of his failures. For Vanessa, the conclusion of the hearing was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind by the encounter ran deep, not just for her, but for the community that had borne the brunt of Stone's abuse. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight. One officer's removal wouldn't fix the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. There was still work to be done, and Vanessa was determined to see it through. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa worked tirelessly behind the scenes, collaborating with local organizations and advocacy groups to address the deeper issues exposed by the incident. She pushed for reforms within the police department, advocating for better training, accountability measures, and community engagement initiatives. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. She received quiet support from unexpected places, including members of the department who recognized the need for change. Even Officer Willis, shaken but resolute, reached out to thank her for her courage and to express his desire to do better as a law enforcement officer. The camp, once a temporary effort to aid the homeless, became a symbol of resilience and hope for the community. With renewed support and resources, it expanded into a permanent outreach center, providing not only food and shelter, but also access to legal aid, job training, and healthcare. Vanessa visited often, not as a judge but as a volunteer, her hands just as willing to carry crates of supplies as they were to sign court orders. Her presence was a reminder that justice wasn't confined to courtrooms, it was a living, breathing effort that required compassion, commitment, and action. Months later, as the city began to heal from the aftershocks of the incident, Vanessa received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the neat script filling the page with careful thought. The sender was a young man who had been at the camp that night, one of the homeless individuals she had stood up for. He wrote about how her bravery had inspired him to turn his life around, to seek help and rebuild the parts of himself he had long since given up on. You reminded me, the letter read, that we all deserve dignity, no matter how far we've fallen. Thank you for fighting for us when no one else would. Vanessa read the letter twice, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. This was why she did what she did, not for accolades or recognition, but for the chance to make a difference, no matter how small. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, a quiet reminder of the work that still lay ahead. And as she prepared for another day on the bench, her mind returned to the words she had spoken to Stone that night, words that echoed through every decision she made. Power without accountability is a betrayal of justice. It was a truth she would carry with her always, a guiding principle in her unyielding quest to build a better, fairer world.